So, magnificent film. It occurred to me, lots of things occurred to me, of course, watching it, but you know, you hear about if you put enough monkeys in a room and have them type for long enough, you'll get Shakespeare. But what happens when you put that many geniuses in one room? Is my mic on? Is your mic on?
I think so.
Okay. Yeah, I just was thinking that there's so much genius in that collaboration between the dancers, between the artistic directors from Palabolas, between Maurice and Arthur. And you can't help but expect to have some kinds of conflict there.
Yeah, heat and light.
But just to back up to the beginning, I saw that there's some National Endowment for the Arts funding for some of this.
Yes.
And how did you get on it so that you were there for right at the beginning?
At the beginning. Like many films, this one grew out of a previous film. It had nothing to do with this, but I had an intern, terrific college student, and it was towards the end of the summer. She had to go back to school, and she said, "Oh, well, before I go back, I'd love to have you and Richard, my husband Richard, and I see my uncle's dance company. They're performing at the Joyce." I said, "Who is it?" She said, "Palabolas." I said, "Oh, I love Palabolas. Haven't seen them in years." We went to see what they were doing, and I went back to thank Michael. Michael Tracy's her uncle. And I was just blown away by their work and not having seen it in some time. I said, "Well, what are you guys doing next?" Be careful, you ask people that. And he said, "Well, we're going to be collaborating with Maurice Sendak on this dark, maybe sort of like a Grimm's fairy tale kind of thing." And I said, "That sounds like a movie." And interestingly, because they are world-class artists and fearless, everybody was on board with it. Knowing that, you know, my terms and conditions were total access all the time. Nobody saw anything until the film was finished. The one thing I shared with them for their own purposes, because of the work they were doing, were bits of the choreography as they were working on it when they couldn't remember certain things. We would make pieces of the dailies available in that way. But other than that, it was a completely hair-raising event from day one. Complete falling off a cliff possibility almost at every rehearsal. The whole thing might have imploded. But the access came through a simple curiosity about what comes next, which is what a lot of this kind of filmmaking is about.
So Palabolas came on board first, and then how did Maurice feel about that?
Maurice really was interested in their work and had known Jonathan before. So they were not exactly next door neighbors, but Palabolas is in Washington Depot, Connecticut, and Maurice is in Ridgefield, where his foundation and his home, which has passed to the foundation, continue to be. So they were kind of in each other's hood and had kind of looked in on each other's work. And Palabolas, maybe 2 or 3 years before, had received money from Ford or Rockefeller, I can't remember, maybe it was Rockefeller, to begin to do these collaborations with people outside their discipline. And it was a very smart thing for them to do because as a company, they had been working together for over 30 years, and they felt, you know, chance and improvisation being their stock in trade, that they needed to kind of refresh their sense of what they were up to and what dance was about by bringing in architects, family therapists, you know, that kind of thing. And that was a perfect opportunity for them to have some kind of funding to work with Maurice. And so he, I think, was, well, you see what he's like. He's a very smart guy, and his antennae are out 800%. So he knew that there was a potential source of friction at the heart of this, but he embraced it. And although it doesn't always look like it, I think they all embraced it. You know?
Well, there's a lot of interesting cuts that you made. I was just thinking that once Palabos had agreed to do the film with you,
Yeah.
that led into your access, that Maurice was on board with that. He thought that was okay to do that.
Oh, and you were asking how he felt about the film?
Yeah, about doing the
film. I went to
film.
everybody at the same time.
Okay.
There would have been no film had he and Arthur
Right.
both not agreed up front.
Right. So, so the way that it plays out, I mean, and it's sort of masterful. One of the masterful parts of this film is there are certain amounts of suspense, because you leave us at a moment when Maurice says, "Well, I feel as if I've been bumped off the rails, and I don't know if I can go forward with this," and then we just cut, and it's like, okay, so what happened? How did it work out from there? So, you know, there's obviously, between that and the next shot that we get, there had to be some more discussion that we don't get to see. So that was kind of interesting.
Well, actually, as best I remember from that particular afternoon, that was kind of the end of the meeting, and Palabos left. I did talk with him further, and it appears elsewhere in the film, but it had more to do with it's some of the interview that has to do with his feeling about the Holocaust and why it was important to him to do that. But the next rehearsal was what you see. It was the next rehearsal, and nobody, I think he did call Michael that night. I wasn't at Michael's home, so I wasn't in on the phone call, but no one knew if he would show up. He called Michael to express his concern and his uncertainty about whether the collaboration could continue. So they were about to start, and they, as you see, Jonathan says, okay, let's, as he says, fuck the artistic directors, let's do the dance.
Let's go get the dancers.
And literally, at that point in time, the door opens and closes, and Maurice and Arthur walk in. And I had no idea if they would come or not either at that point. So.
And that's not the end of it either, because then there's bit by bit as things go forward, and there's the acts, the nudity and the other elements of it, and where there's schlock or whatever, and you get the sense of, I mean, that's one of the great things about the movie, is that there's the elements of creating this work,
right,
and this sort of magnificent work, and how that came to be, and then there's the question of artistic impulse, ego, power, the structures of all those things, and it all gets teased out beautifully without hitting you on the head about it. It's just that these are the people, and this is what the process is like. So I don't know, how much did you have to cut down from this?
A lot. I mean, we filmed fully. The way Palabos works is each year, I believe they're still doing this, they create at least 3 new dances for which they are always obligated to give the Joyce world premiere. And they have always, out of town, tried out what they're doing at the American Dance Festival, as you see here. And I think in this case they were also offered a kind of workshop at Purchase. So we covered those things. So we were filming with them almost fully for the 8 or 9 months before, from when they knew what their next season was going to be until they began the performances. And then we went back and filmed again after they had gone through 1 season. And also because I wanted to give them the chance to sit with it and to reflect and to say what they wanted to say about what the experience had been. I felt that was only fair, since I was not bringing them into the process of making the film once we were in the cutting room. So it was only fair to go back to them and let them completely unpack their feelings about it.
So when you were filming the dance, not only in the choreography rehearsals and where they were creating it, which was just fascinating to me, but when you were filming it on the stage, what was that like technically to try and set that up? I mean, you have lighting, you have wonderful lighting set up for yourself, but the rest of it, where the cameras go, how do you work that?
There were certain venues where we were able to have much more access to the stage, pretty much fully in Purchase and quite a bit at ADF, American Dance Festival. And actually, I think we may have been one of the first film crews that the Joyce allowed also to have cameras off stage in the wings. And we were filming during the rehearsals on stage at the Joyce, which ordinarily they don't allow. So when they were doing tech, full tech, so we essentially had what the conditions were going to be for the performance, we had access to certain kinds of angles and shots that we obviously couldn't when an audience was there. And when the audience was there, I think we had 4 cameras or 5 covering, back of the house, side of the house, from the wings. So we were able to get a fair amount of coverage for that specific premiere performance at the Joyce. That was important. We had
and that's all on film.
Yeah. No, we filmed it all.
Yeah.
And obviously you don't see all of it, but it was fully covered when we were doing it.
Now the film came out 15 years ago.
Yeah,
and I sort of remember that from.
It was the Hamptons Film Festival 15 years ago.
Yes, because I was at the newspaper at the time.
And you wrote what is still the best review of a film ever written.
So from that experience of that, I mean, how did the film do at that time beyond the film festival? And
it was at a lot of festivals. It won a lot of awards. It was shortlisted for an Academy Award, so it got around quite a bit. I think probably not as much as a film. I'm not saying this film, but a film with that kind of interest would get around now, because happily now there's much more of a commercial life for feature documentaries. I mean, there were a number of us here in the audience for whom that's our world, and I think in that sense it's a good time, for feature documentaries now. On the other hand, it's much more competitive now even than it was 15 years ago. So many good films are being made. And they're also being made for a ton more money than this one was made for.
Absolutely.
So,
So, did you continue to have a relationship with Maurice afterwards?
Very much so, yeah. And with Pilobolus. I made several more films for them and with them, and I remained close to Maurice. Sadly, I didn't see him in the last year or 2 before he died, but I've said it before, and it's absolutely true. He changed my life. I mean, I learned from him something about the uncompromising but tender and utterly flexible and completely open-ended nature of what you have to do if you're going to be a creative person. You've got to take it to the mat, fang and claw, and at the same time, in a way, be utterly receptive to what's actually happening. I mean, he was extraordinary in that way. In addition to which, he always had his wits about him. I mean, the guy was profane and devilishly funny all the time, and never lost what was at the heart of it for him. I mean, he always had a bead on why he was doing this. And there's just infinite lessons to be learned from someone like that.
And that was not just from making this film, but that was from your relationship going forward?
It overwhelmed me while we were making the film, but it was cemented in a certain way, after I too had the chance, to sort of step back from it a bit in time. And I'm not sure that I've lived up to it, but it's right there in my experience as a point of reference.
It becomes a part of you, that thing. So it's not a question of living up to it, it's just a question of continuing it, in my view. And I think you certainly have lived up to it, as far as I can tell.
Thank you.
I think that one other thing I would say is that absolute genius of the last shots of taking down the name of the thing and then leaving the us at the end, which is the ultimate dictum on the collaboration, which is absolute genius. So, was there anything else you'd like to say about this film, about this project? What you thought was going on? Because we're sort of running out of time here. But
I'm more than happy to take people's questions. I mean, I think films should actually speak for themselves. So you'll take away whatever you take away from it. But if you have questions, I'm happy
well,
to.
we're sort of out of time here, but if anybody wants to ask a question or make a comment. Anybody? Right there.
So I found it curious that you showed us the reviews before we actually got to see the piece. So it actually, personally, affected my own opinion while I was watching it.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was interesting choice to make.
In a way, that seemed to me interesting because that was part of the collaborative process. That was like an insight into how Maurice said he reacts to reviews.
Yeah.
And seeing those things from an out-of-town workshop
Yeah.
before the big premiere. I don't know, as a performer, I know that I won't read a review. I can't stand to read a review because it puts me in my head.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Which is, I don't want to be there, but that is a point because in a lot of situations, people say, if you're going to see a work of art, don't ever read a review ahead of time because then you're not a tabula rasa. But that's an interesting point to look at it first.
Yeah, I mean, the review where he creates the ending about the hard-on and all of that, that was a review from the American Dance Festival. It wasn't New York. And so showing the reviews beforehand really for me was an opportunity just again to show something about him and his attitude about how to keep going despite the kinds of reviews you sometimes get. But point well taken. I mean,
how did Terry Teachout get to be part of this from the beginning?
He had followed Pilopoulos for years. He was a kind of, he wrote a feature piece, maybe, I can't remember where it appeared, but he was following them for other reasons. So this happened to be what they were working on that year when he was writing about them for other reasons.
That's incredible.
Why he was there.
Incredible. Well, an incredible movie, and thank you so much for sharing it with us, Mary.
Thanks. You're a wonderful audience.